A number of things have happened in the political scene over the last few days. The president addressed the nation on how COVID would be moving on, what kind of new directives are going to be taking place, and opening a few other things that excited Ugandans. We also had a bit of unfortunate comments from the president in relation to bail around the swearing in of judges, the new judges, and a couple of other things in the world. So today on the Women's Show, we will be talking about all of these things. Good afternoon to our viewers and welcome. My name is Alesi. I will be your host today. And I'm excited to be joined by excellent women who have contributed to public discourse, but also to making our country better. Today on the show, we have Cissy Kagaba. Cissy, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much.
And we have Tricia Nabaye, not a very new face to the show. Tricia, you're welcome.
Thank you.
So off into the conversation, let's start from the presidential address. We were all waiting to hear what new thing the president was going to say. We'll start from the most important thing, and that's vaccination. So the president said that for nightlife in Uganda to open, we need to have vaccinated 4.8 million people, but also for schools to be able to open. And one of the comments he made specifically on education was that for higher education institutions would be allowed to open once all their students are vaccinated. How is this going to be viable, especially by November?
Thank you very much for that. It's a question of numbers and viability. Are they really, speaking to the masses that we have? Are people actually getting vaccinated? Or are we, wishy-washing away, the health of different individuals? So for schools opening, I might be interested in a vaccine, but you certainly may not be. So in between having anti-vaxxers and people that will downright not allow to be vaccinated, we are playing with statistics and data. So 4 million people to be vaccinated and for nightlife to open up, which necessarily isn't a big thing, but I know there are people who call it big. But most importantly, for the education sector to be able to run, to have all these students vaccinated, it is something. It's a wish. It's a wish upon the stars, and I'm hoping that as we have this conversation, we can also come to the reality that as long as vaccination is a choice and not a law, there are a lot of people who are going to opt out. I think that is what I want to speak on that for now.
Okay, so Cissy, aside from just the idea that some people want to get vaccinated and some people don't want to get vaccinated, there have also been challenges in the process. And I think that's one of the things the president was completely silent on, whether it's corruption or whether it is not enough information for people to be able to actually take up the vaccine. Because we're telling people, take the vaccine, but we're not giving them the necessary information, whether it's in terms of side effects or in terms of, like, what's the process like? So what would you say to that?
I mean, our government, I think, has always been very good at giving directives. Our government has always been very good at enacting probably either laws. But the challenge, of course, that always comes in is enforcement and implementation. Now, we're in the vaccine process. How adequate and efficient has actually government ensured that people at the grassroots actually are getting this information on vaccination? Now, the president directing that if people are not, if vaccines expire, the RDC, the COW, and the DHOs are going to be dismissed. That does not actually cure the problem. The issue is, why aren't people being vaccinated? And then what has government actually done to ensure that people are being vaccinated? And then the broader question we need to ask ourselves is, are the vaccines enough? Because again, we've seen situations whereby people probably want to be vaccinated, but the vaccines are not there. Now, when the whole issue of record keeping, do we keep record of who has been vaccinated? Because again, we've seen particular countries saying that if you're coming from Uganda, even if you've been vaccinated, you have to quarantine yourself because of forgery. Now, how good is our record keeping? That is actually, that record keeping, we've set a very bad precedent of forgery that is also affecting people that are traveling, who have actually been adequately vaccinated. People who are getting vaccines from, I mean, we've gotten vaccines from particular countries, but these particular countries are still saying, no, if you're coming from Uganda, you still need to quarantine yourself for. So, I mean, there's also lack of trust from other countries, because as a country we put systems in place, but some of these systems are not working. And I think for me, one of the issues that caught my eye again was, we are buying 3.2 from government of Uganda, 3.2 million vaccines. Government has appropriated more money than this. Are we saying that the 3.2 million shillings is that the amount of money that is supposed to buy these vaccines, or we should actually expect much more? Because of course the president says between September and December. But again, before that, we've been appropriating monies for these vaccines. So for me, the issue is accountability. The 3.2, is it worth the amount of money that has been appropriated? Where are the other monies? Where is the other money? Where are other vaccines going to come from when it comes to appropriation of the monies that government has so far taken out?
Yes, you talked about the capacity of whether it's local government structures or decentralized structures, and that's something the president highlighted a lot, that this process must continue to be decentralized. But speaking to the bigger vaccine problem, that we're receiving donations from countries where the vaccine has 3 months to expire. So at the point at which it's set off and it arrives here and goes through the process of recording, shouldn't we also be, as citizens of African countries, in the larger discussion, be pushing for more vaccine equity as opposed to just accepting what it is that we are getting? I'll start with you, Tricia.
I think in the geopolitics of this world, we've become the trash bin of the and I'm sorry to say that,
Yes.
but it is the reality that we live in. At the beginning of this discourse, we were even worried if we would get vaccines. And lo and behold, COVAX came in and helped, disseminate to different African countries. And here we are now with vaccines with an expiration of 3 months, and they've been dumped, literally dumped on us. And it's almost like taking the spoils of the earth, like whatever we do not need, we will give to Africa. But then also when we speak to local governments and how they can then help in the decentralization of these vaccines, without structures and institutions that are working, we are actually working against ourselves and against time to be able to have, maybe 80% or 50%, because I think our population is a little bit of the younger. So 50% of our population being vaccinated. So if we do not have a mechanism of, decentralizing and making sure that these structures actually are working, we are going to beat ourselves on time on expiration of these vaccines. But then also we need to be selective in what we allow to be given. It is setting a precedent. Maybe we could do it with these vaccines. Choose what you're given. You can't just be taking the spoils of the earth. I mean, you're not giving me a 3 month expiration date vaccine for my people, and yet you're going to go to the airport and tell me don't come in. We actually don't want people who are vaccinated with AstraZeneca. So I'm imagining as we are going on, this conversation should go away from just how do we decentralize so people can get the vaccine, but then also the geopolitics of this world of how do we not allow so that we are not put on tension and panic to be able to, disseminate these vaccines at a quick speed. But then going forward, it is also a question of governance. How do we make sure that not only for the vaccines, but for the regional discourse of how do we have our local governments working? How do we have sub-county level people working so we don't have to fire them, so that they can continue working, and also so that services can be delivered? That's a bigger discourse.
Okay, Cissy, how can I know that the World Health Organization, especially like the commissioners who are from Africa or live in sub-Saharan Africa, have been doing the greatest part of the pushback and saying, listen, we cannot distribute vaccines like this. How can African presidents use their political clout? Because I think we're just taking this thing lightly and not doing the necessary pushback we need in order to not rely on donations, but rather have access to what would ensure sustainability in the process.
Yeah.
Well, I think just a brief about the decentralization. Again, we need to ask ourselves that has the decentralization process worked? The broader decentralization, has it worked? So if it hasn't worked, then how are we going to expect that when it comes to the vaccine, people being vaccinated and that entire process, that by a miracle the process is going to work? There are quite a number of government reports that actually show that most government health centers, across the country, are not fully staffed. So if they're not fully staffed, then how are they actually going to administer the vaccines? I think for me, those are some of the issues that we need to look at. And then the vaccine distribution chain. We've talked of, we're being this like a dumping site now. By the time the drugs come, they go to NMS, and by the time NMS starts distributing them to areas like Moroto and Nakapiripirit, when are they going to reach? Now, by the time they reach, are people there ready to receive the vaccines? Have they been notified that, okay, guys, the vaccines are going to be here by Tuesday, kindly come? So there's again lack of information and lack of coordination. So even if probably had sufficient vaccines, we still have issues of coordination. We still have issues of ensuring that the public goes for vaccine for vaccinations. Because I mean, if I don't have information that I'm going to get, because I know government has tried to put out this list showing that from this date to this date go to this particular, but people have gone there and the vaccines are not there. Now, if I go once and the vaccines are not, I'm not going to go back. So even if we got sufficient vaccines, without first addressing some of the underlying issues that are causing people not to go for these vaccines, still they will not go. And if it's only 3 months to expire, look at that chain from, I mean, we have Pfizer. And Pfizer is supposed to be stored under particular degrees. Now, NMS said they do actually have the fridges. That is under, probably they do. Now, do these other health centers, exactly, or is NMS going to move with its fridges at that level? No, seriously, because I'm thinking about it. I saw that the spokesperson saying yes, and I agree, probably they do. But how about these other centers that are supposed to administer this vaccine? Do they actually have these minus whatever where Pfizer is supposed to be stored? Now, if people keep asking themselves such questions, they're going to be very resistant to go for some of those drugs. And maybe the issue of our president being able to push back, I don't really think that is a priority to them. We need to be very frank that, I mean, as long as them and the people that are surrounding them are already vaccinated, that is it. I mean, ask yourselves, if schools up to now are not being opened, and it to be very, very easy, get the kids to school, then bring the vaccines, vaccinate them from that is the best way than keeping the kids at home. Now, and when the president says, no, I'm not going to open up until, again, it's going to become, because the same kids are also facing the same situation of going to particular health centers and the drugs are not there. But broadly, when you go back to the question that you asked, why don't we ensure that we push back, ensure that we have sufficient vaccines? I think for me, it's not a priority. Of course, our president may assume or they may come out and posture that it is a priority. But indeed, I think that is not a priority to them. And even the monies that have actually, because remember when this wave was coming, when COVID was coming, we knew, I mean, people started hearing of these things from other countries. Now, I would expect to plan. And our governments have guys that can really plan. But again, it goes back to priorities. If those were our of course, we know, yes, other countries, developed countries, have already booked the vaccines. Yes. But again, we also know that within the African region, there are countries that have actually gone ahead and probably vaccinated almost 3/4 of the. Why now? Why aren't some other countries doing that? Directly or indirectly, it goes back to the priorities of those countries. So even if we got all these vaccines, let us say Uganda is receiving all the required vaccines, let us say December, I can assure you those vaccines will expire. Because one, we don't have the systems yet in place. People are not yet well sensitized. The sensitization can be here in Kampala on radios. But you go up country and tell me how many sensitization drives have been made and how many of them people actually listening to some of these. It doesn't. So what the president now has resorted to is to making threats that if they expire, I'm going to. Yeah, but that is not the best approach. You cannot resort to threat when the mindset of the people or the people who are supposed to receive these vaccines hasn't yet changed.
Maria, maybe to piggyback on what Wash has been saying is also the realities of the East African community and maybe even AU as a whole. As presidents, you ultimately would have thought that they would have a collective push on how, Africa accesses vaccines and how, we deal with this virus because it was a global pandemic. But as a continent, we needed a strategy as Africa. And in lack of that, we then became nationally seeking. I mean, you have the East African community dismantle when it came to COVID, and everyone had a national strategy. Rwanda had one, Tanzania had one, Kenya had one, and all were speaking to something different from what every other country was speaking. But we are speaking about integration and, and consolidating the African Union. And in the lack of that, we actually realized different people had different priorities. While Uganda is stuck on having children home, all the other East African countries opened up for their children to have. So you actually realize that different people had different strategies, and they weren't coming together as presidents of the East African community or even of the African Union to, have a front where they can, push for vaccines, push for a mass drive, and make sure that, we get out of this pandemic I think in one of our conversations we've already said it's going to become an African problem.
Yes.
The world has opened up, people are in schools, systems are opening, markets are growing, but it's going to become an African problem.
Yes, for us, we're on the God of
Mm.
Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac for our education sector. No, but you see, it's very unfortunate because it's important to understand that. I remember the Daily Monitor ran a story about an accident at one of the international schools, and I think the story was less about the accident, but more about the fact that the person who had knocked the other was from dropping their child off at school, and yet the vast majority of Uganda's citizens are at home with no options, because it's easy, and maybe that comes from the bigger governance conversation we're having, that if maybe we had more if government officials were mandated to take their children to government schools, then we would have had this problem solved. Because if your child is going to the British school in Muyenga, and others are going to Kitante, and you're not worried about Kitante. But really just moving forward from there is to ask a question about what is it that we should be thinking more honestly about as citizens in relation to the future of the vast majority of Ugandans, because many of them are not in Kampala in Zoom classes. Many of them are upcountry where you can barely get any network, even if you had access to information. So what should we be doing differently as citizens?
Thank you for that. A lot of times when we have these conversations, I hate to speak from this point, because then I get myself in an elitist corner, and then I'm speaking as though I have not known the problems of people in the rural areas. I was watching a documentary done by COVAX and UNESCO, and they're trying to get vaccines to the islands. And they could only travel with 10 vaccines. 10 vaccines in a small freezer bag to go to an island on a boat. And that is a reality. That is just one of the realities, that to get vaccines, you get 10 in not a go, but once in a while when we get them, we'll bring to the islands. But now for the rural majority, the reality is, for any case, as long as we have this margin that divides them, I mean, these conversations almost feel like they are for Kampala. So then you go, a few kilometers out of Kampala, and the realities of COVID look like, what is going on? Like where are we? How are we going on? How is school going to happen? Because these are people, then, if we should make policy, or if we should make directives, or we should make measures, we should be targeting those people, because to have a bottom-up approach is a little bit more easier than to have a top-bottom. Because every other time we'll have that, there'll be a threshold of people that will be carried along, and those that will be left behind. So the realities of a person that is in the village is that either they'll never get vaccinated, and they'll never go back to school. So they have to find alternatives to, having a livelihood and to going on with life and business as usual. And that is a broader conversation we need to have. How are we, leaving no one behind in our poverty discussions, in our education discussions, in our vaccine discussions? How are we making sure that a person in the camp, Lamidere, is getting vaccines, or a person in Arua will be vaccinated, regardless of whether they'll get the COVID or not? So that's a broader conversation, but then also to realize that it is a majority that we leave behind. I mean, whenever we're having conversations on schools, we'll have Chitante, we'll have Green Hill, but we will not remember a government school in the village where most probably even for the past 2 years they've not had any initiative in going back to school. So those are the realities we live with. How we address them, I don't know. Also, me myself, the president should be able to inform us. Yes.
I like the question that you talked about Zoom. And quite a number of schools are actually going the Zoom way. But the irony is, when you look at the budget that was read, this financial year's budget, we have an increase on taxes on internet. That is a clawback, and that is a very big irony. Now, remember that, I mean, you actually can find yourself spending 10 or so thousand in a day just on data for the kids to attend Zoom. Then, which type of kids are able to attend Zoom? Not everyone is going to attend Zoom. You're going to need a smartphone. Now, how many, either a smartphone, you're going to need a laptop. Well, just in the event. That means if the kid doesn't have a phone, then you need to buy a laptop. And then you have to ensure that there is internet, or you get a Wi-Fi, you get another extra phone, or things like that. Now, those are all monies that are being spent. During this period, have we seen any stimulus package that is coming out? Because you've put taxes on the net, on the internet, and yet you expect kids to study. How? And then those that are deep in the villages, how are they studying? When it comes to exams, they sit the same exams. And that's what I'm saying. I think we have a government that doesn't really care about education. Its priorities are upside down, because you cannot be within the pandemic situation and you're not reducing. While Uganda was putting taxes or increasing taxes on the net, Tanzania was actually putting them, reducing. Then you ask ourselves, what is wrong with our government, especially when it comes to education? I like what she said, that other countries have opened up when it comes to education. We are still closed in. It goes back to priorities. Are we really, really passionate about the future generation? The example that you gave about international schools being opened. You see, there was a time when our leaders were telling us to be patriotic. Being patriotic, that take your kids to government schools. But the issue is how many of them are being patriotic, because we need to emulate them.
Yes.
So how many of them are being patriotic and taking their kids to government? They're not doing that because they know that the quality and the standard is poor. But they're the ones that are making these policies. They're the ones that are appropriating the monies. They're the ones that clap when the budget is read by the Ministry of Finance. And what is ironical is, do we ever see actually a translation of how those taxes are being used? All we see in most cases are supplementary budgets. Where are these supplementary budgets going? Look at the sectors that they're going to. They're going to defense, they're going to state house. Have we seen a supplementary budget going to education? Of course, I know they're saying that they want to buy some materials or something, I read somewhere. But remember, the same Ministry of Education has given money to buy radios. What happened to the radios? So we have a lot of wastage as a country, and our priorities are not aimed at ensuring that the local, and when I mean local, I mean the person who is at the village level, how are they moving on? Because the kids were still interested in going to school, but their parents are actually poor. They cannot have those virtual classes. And even some schools up country, they cannot afford having virtual classes, because it's different whereby a parent is willing, but has the school put systems in place to ensure that kids, to send out those links on a daily to ensure that, okay, click on the link and get into the class. Schools up country, hardly, few of them are actually doing that. And then when it comes to exams, so we have a generation that is going to be stunted. Now, and you're comparing this generation with the generation that is within the East African region. And yet we are talking of East Africanism and moving together. And yet when you look at the priorities of our country, they're totally different, not geared towards education.
Yes. I like that. I'm also surprised that 2 years later, we have not found alternative ways to do this education thing, aside from, because, I feel like we just jump on the next bus. They've said Zoom, then everybody goes on Zoom, but we're not thinking about how do we make education more community-based, as opposed to people moving right, left, and center, that by now we should have gone and said village level, these are the number of children here, these are the classes that are available, where can we get teachers to ensure that these kids are able to go to school? Because that way I feel like if someone did get COVID, it's easier to manage because it's easier to trace as well. But moving on from the whole COVID situation, recently we had a couple of new judges sworn in, and the president made his famous statement on the debate of bail, that people should not be given bail because we're giving big criminals bail. And this comes on the back of Honorable Segirinya and Honorable Sewanyana being arrested under very unclear circumstances. How do we move away from this continuous idea that Ugandans must be deprived of their rights simply because the head of state feels a certain way about things? Yes, Tricia.
Thank you very much. And the question of bail is very political in itself, because the comments the president made speak to a death of an institution, and that's a judiciary. If rules do not apply anymore, then we are bound to have, one person make the rules for all of us. And that is where we are. So when you have, people granted bail and then hijacked or even kidnapped at a point at the gate of the prisons, and when you look at the videos that circulated, you actually see the prison warders trying to, ward off people from even stopping them. Don't stop the drone. You should take people. So those questions are more political, but then also they speak to the growing narrative of a weakening opposition. and not just the opposition as political parties, but also opposition in speaking to civil society and to the, you know, the rules of the game changing, because violence or any other thing is also a language. So when you have directives from the president, that is also another language that has come into the play, that he will be the sole rule of law in this nation. And it speaks to the realities of, I mean, if I went to courts of law today, I wouldn't be thinking of justice. I'd be thinking of putting my case on record that they were caught wanting, but not that I'm going to get justice. And that is the bigger question that we have to ask today. Can we trust our courts of law?
One, bail is a constitutional right.
Yeah.
And I know that there have been various instances where the president has actually come out and tried to bring up the bail discussion. But I think for me, the issue is not bail. The issue is expediting the process. Other than denying people their rights, if you really want to get a person and charge them, the process can actually be expedited. And we've seen it. There are particular cases where government has been interested and the case is actually expedited.
Yeah.
So other than incarcerating people for a period we don't know when, expedite the process and let justice be felt. And it's rather unfortunate that this statement was made when judges were being sworn in, because we expect an independent judiciary. So if the judiciary is not independent of such statements, then how does the public perceive the judiciary? And I think because remember that the judiciary is supposed to be a temple, the courts of law are supposed to be temples of justice. So if such statements are made, then people are actually going to go to these temples of justice, quote unquote, with a perception that they're not going to get justice. Would have expected people of the judiciary to come out and say, no, bail is a constitutional right, we're going to do A, B, C, D. And because if people now fail to trust the courts, we need to ask ourselves what is going to be the alternative to that. Because when you talk of bail, yeah, but that means people are going to stop trusting the system. Now, what happens if people fail to trust a system where they expect to get justice? That is actually going to be catastrophic for our country. And I think we need to, the president and those that advise him need to look at the bigger picture. That as Ugandans, we need to trust our judicial system, that we can go to these courts of law and get justice without any form of interference. Because the alternative is more costly than that.
Yeah. Yes, of course, that comes on a bit of worries, because we know that the president's MO has always been to hire cadres as judges. So now you have a chief justice who says the things that he says. You have an attorney general who has been the president's lawyer, or a lawyer for that NRM for the longest time. So I don't think there's any way we should expect any kind of pushback from the judges. But just on the idea of shrinking of spaces for people, Dr. Chris Bariomonsi made a statement, I think 2 days ago, where he talked about how they are finding a way to control social media because Ugandans are using it for the wrong reasons, right? And for me, thinking just about that and thinking about statements from the president like that, but also thinking about every other thing that has been happening, it's the way UCC is completely very responsive to what they consider anti-government statements on the internet, but will never do anything about the bad internet we have as a country and leaving us at the mercy of MTN and Airtel right now. And for me, it's how then, is there any hope? Because we've been at this, we've talked about these things, we talked about them in 2011, we talked about them in 2016, here we are in 2021, still having the same exact conversations. Is there any hope for how it is that we're ever going to get out of this little bubble or cycle of what is happening?
I think freedoms, and especially when it comes to digital rights and cyber rights, it's contentious because a lot of people have not yet come to a place where they understand the politics around that. But then also government doesn't know how to regulate it any better than shut it down. And when we shut it down, we lose money. And then you have issues of, oh, we are going to talk to Facebook. And then you're looking at, what
Facebook
is...
buys us as a country.
What is Uganda to Facebook?
Yes.
So those are questions that keep coming up. And I'm very glad that the biggest example of, we can mute you down was on Donald Trump. Because then you have a president of a first world being cut off social media to the point where he has nothing, he can't associate outside social media, within social media. And for dictatorial governments, it then speaks to the fact that, digital rights are going to be pushed for more. We are going to have a lot of, cyber activists come up. But then also we need to have, discourse on how we learn our rights, our freedoms that are encompassed into the cyber spaces. And I love activists because they speak to the future of advocacy. I mean, they'll cut off the Uganda police websites. They'll cut off, but just to make a statement.
Yes.
And I think as a country, we then need to find ways of organizing around these digital spaces that we can, leverage them and make sure while government is pushing back, we are also equally pushing back. It is more to our gain that we learn how to leverage these spaces. Know your rights. What are the cyber norms of digital platforms? Because they are there. So know the cyber norms, know your rights. I want people to go back and look at the Stella Nyanzi case on her cyber case and, find out what happened, what was pivotal in that case, how did it overturn, so that you know how to deal with the issues as they unfold, so that you know your rights, even as you're organizing in these digital spaces. For internet, it's going to take us a long time for us to come to a place where our government realizes that actually internet is now one of the most basic rights in our era as we go into the digital world. Because as we push into the fourth industrial revolution, we are bound to be left behind if we still have the tendencies of shut it down, overtax it, and then everything else will be happening. We're like, how did they leave us? People are doing AI. For us, we are there. We will cut off Facebook, VPN. So that is that.
At least the VPN people are making money off us, right? Yes, Cissy.
When you talk of shutting down the net or whatever social media, because Ugandans are using it for the wrong reasons. I think, we all know that it is in total contravention of the Constitution, because it's freedom of speech. I know, of course, yes, there may be some bit of clawbacks or exceptions, but again, we need to ask ourselves, what are the wrong reasons? Who determines what these wrong reasons are? Are the wrong reasons because people are castigating the government because of its policies? Are the wrong reasons because people are airing their views? And again, you cannot control what people are going to keep saying, and you're not going to think that in order for you to control them, you're going to shut it down. Again, I'll refer to this year's budget that was read. Digitalization is one of those things that government was holding key in this budget. Now, when you're talking of shutting it down or trying to squeeze the space, again, you're contravening your own priorities that you've put in your budget this year. So, and we can't have a government that continuously keeps on threatening people that you're going to shut it down, you're going to open up, and you're going to shut. It just can't work that way, because we are advancing and we can't be left behind. The only thing is people to probably be cautious of the things that they are putting out there, because I know, there have been sedition cases as a result of, what people are putting. But you see, you can't think that people are only going to say the things that you want them to hear, that you want to hear. And as a country, our leaders need to be accommodative, because many a times we've had the president himself come out and use, abusive words. These people are pigs, these ones are these. And, no one has ever told the president, please no. So I think for me, when we are talking of social media, we cannot continuously think of clamping it down. You cannot squeeze that space, because it is important. What government needs to do is to listen to those dissent or to those voices that are not agreeing with it, and try and pick a leaf from. If it's access to information, provide the information. Government has very many social media people that it is working with. Why doesn't it use those people to actually counter that wrong information or the wrong reasons that government is saying that? Chris Perry almost is saying that we need to shut it down or squeeze it because we're using it for the wrong reasons. And let government use, I think government can actually use the same media for the right reasons to counter people who are putting out wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think to piggyback on that quickly is the discourse on dissent and curtailing dissent. You say what I don't like and then I clamp down on you. It is also a governance issue, because we've come from the public order management bill, and then it turned into law, and then people are like, what, it's not in ground with what is happening. So now that you're not organizing physically, people have now created spaces where they can organize and talk. And then you feel like because it's dissent to what you're doing, or it's questions on accountability, we need to, cut their voices off and shut them down. Rather than that, she says a very valid point. Leverage, even government should leverage these spaces to be able to say, you know what, they say this, but we are saying the alternative to that was this. I remember when the president, when there was conversation on Twitter on the president dying, and then alongside that conversation, there was a twinning and accountability for the money. I'm telling you, President Museveni came and spoke about his death, and that we will get the people who are talking about my death, but never at any point spoke to the accountability that was needed in the Ministry of Health. So that is just one example of, you know, how they should be using it to better leverage that space and, you know, provide for accountability, use it to you know, to have conversations on government institutions and what they are doing, and also push their services online, because as we can see, paperwork is no longer a thing for the future. I think that is key for them as government to pick on.
No, I think that's a really interesting thing that you said about like the priorities of conversation and what determines what is actual conversation. I remember I heard from Dr. Peter Mwesige, who said that the freedom of expression also comes with the freedom to offend. That I'm going to offend you just because I like my freedom of expression doesn't mean I must just sing your praises. It also means that I have the right to offend you, but also knowing that someone else has the right to offend me in the process. Yes, and so just to wrap up, I don't know if any of you came across, there's a letter that has been going around this morning from the Ministry of Finance. It's a letter on development partners and what the process should be for them, because I think a story read over the weekend about how Cabinet wants to approve all sorts of engagement around development ideas, whether it's NGOs, CSOs, but also the partners who receive the money, that these projects must be approved by Cabinet. Just broadly, what do you have to say about that? What are your thoughts on that? Yes.
Thank you. We had a conversation about that in our Monday morning meeting. And the question was, you know, it's null and void in its way, because, you know, it doesn't speak to the Paris Agreement on aid, on dissemination of aid. And it's also not practical in implementation, in theory and in practice. I mean, there is no way development partners are going to be able to, you know, to come and you know, give you such accountability or such reporting. But then also it is a conversation on you know, clamping still of our civil society spaces and reducing, you know, the level of financing that goes to civil society. So there is little we can do about it, because its implementation is very disastrous as its theory in presenting this letter. So, I mean, funding for us is a conversation we are going to continually, you know, be having conversation on, especially in creating alternatives to funding as civil society. And that is how we have, you know, institutions like Ujasiri and Nafasi that are coming up to help us, you know, create sustainability, a conversation around sustainability. So while, you know, the space between development partners and government is looking rather shady, I know there is little money that can go through development partners into government, because aid then is given to civil society to help fill that gap most of the times. So for us as civil society, what do we take out of this conversation is to create alternatives to sustainability. How do we, you know, continue delivering services? How do we continue, you know, enabling people to thrive, you know, organize citizens into spaces where they can articulate their issues and their needs without, you know, having a gap on funding and on financing? I think that's a question for us as civil society. For government and Ministry of Finance, that is a conversation that they will have, but I don't think it's implementable.
When you look at the letter, I mean, it's obvious the letter is targeting NGOs, because much as they try to bring in components of government, but we know that MDAs have always been approving the budgets and think I mean, we know. So I think it's just window dressing to show that, well, it's not you guys, but we're also trying to. So it obviously goes back to the shrinking civic space. But again, on the brighter side for me, this means that the work that NGOs have been doing is really effective. True. Because then why would you want to go for something that is not effective? True. So you only squeeze that which you feel is making an impact against you. So some of these letters that we see are a vindication to civil society that, or to NGOs, that the work that we have been doing has not been in vain. It has probably touched the nerves where we wanted it to touch, and as a result of that, the space has to be squeezed. So for me, yeah, so for me, it actually shows that we're doing a great job, because otherwise, if we weren't, why bother legislate? I mean, why bother taking these things to cabinet and come up with all those interesting bureaucratic ways of ensuring that donors bring these projects to you and all that stuff? Because we all know that when the donors bring these projects, the ones for government will be approved, the ones for civil society or NGOs will be put there and all that. Yeah. So it's aimed at frustrating them because they're saying things we don't want to hear, or they're telling people things that they shouldn't actually be telling them, because they're actually opening their minds up. Yeah.
No, I think that's a very important point. Me, the first thing that came to my mind is, listen, why would I want to be a cabinet minister and be concerned? Like, I come to a cabinet meeting and I'm concerned about these small things when we have much bigger problems to solve. Because even the money that comes to NGOs or civil society organizations from bilateral agreements is very small money. The bigger chunk of it actually goes to government for budget support and different things like that. So I don't like you said, priorities, where we are as a people. Yes. So I just want to say thank you very much, Cissy and Tricia, for sharing with us your time this afternoon, for sharing with us your mind, because especially in a country like ours, sometimes it gets really complicated to talk about some of these things publicly. So thank you very much. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of the Women's Show. We'll keep bringing you more conversations on the politics of this country, governance issues, but also just social and economic issues that affect the nation, but also specifically women on days where things are actually very specific like that. But thank you so much, and we look forward to having you again. Bye-bye.